In the first 18 months of its second term, the Trump administration has continued its efforts to establish authoritarian rule by using immigration as the instrument for dismantling the democratic rights of the entire population. The aim of a powerful section of the American ruling class in carrying this strategy through is to abolish the Constitution and the democratic rights won through the American Revolution and Civil War. Through this political initiative, the federal government has declared war on the population. Consider the scale of the disruption to social life in the working class in just the last year and a half. Tens of thousands of ICE and CBP agents are presently operating as an extra-legal paramilitary within the state. In cities and towns throughout the country, they are arresting, on average, by their own numbers, 3,000 people a day. This means that on a daily basis, there are 3,000 families, 3,000 workplaces, 3,000 classrooms that are directly impacted by the crackdown. On a given night, roughly 66,000 people are detained in hundreds of internment camps, and 500,000 people total have been processed through ICE detention centers in one way or another since Trump took office. According to ProPublica, 200,000 children have had a mother or father detained by ICE in the last 18 months. 145,000 of these children are American citizens. According to the Brookings Institute, 64% of high school principals say that immigrant families in their districts are pulling children out of schools for fear of raids. And according to the Marshall Project, over 6,200 children have themselves been detained by ICE since Trump came to office at the notorious internment camp in Dilley, Texas. Legally, through this historically unprecedented campaign, the Trump administration is working to establish a state of exception. It has taken the executive branch far beyond the outer edges of its legal authority. It has invoked several emergency laws that lie at the core of the American ruling class's historic tools of class self-preservation, laws like the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 and the Smith Act. It has threatened to establish martial law by invoking the Insurrection Act. It has deployed troops to major cities. It has turned the language and legal tools of the war on terror against the domestic population, the so-called enemy within, including by assassinating citizens and sentencing young protesters to life in prison for expressing opposition to detention conditions at the Prairieland concentration camp outside of Dallas, Texas. It has brazenly attacked the separation of powers principle, violating federal court orders. Its highest officials have discussed suspending habeas corpus, invoking the Constitution's suspension clause, the tool of last resort, concluding for the time being that the conditions were not right yet. Whatever remained of American democracy is breaking down before our eyes in real time. No institution of the political establishment is stopping Trump. He has been aided and abetted by a Congress dominated by insurrectionists. Whatever opposition exists among the district courts is essentially nullified by the compromised Supreme Court, which came one vote away from sanctioning Trump's brazen attempt to overturn the 14th Amendment by executive fiat. How could any institution of the capitalist state, any bourgeois political party, be expected to oppose Trump and his strategy when they are each and all responsible not only for creating the political conditions for his rise, but also in a very concrete and direct way for sharpening the legal and operational implements that Trump and his fascist advisors are now using with all deliberate speed against the domestic population? Especially in the 30 years and 35 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, dating back in particular to the Clinton administration and continuing on a through line through all subsequent administrations. The Democrats and Republicans have collaborated to create a massive domestic police force through the Department of Homeland Security, to construct a network of concentration camps, to arm this apparatus with military equipment, give them immunity from accountability, cover them with the extra legal authority that was created on a bipartisan basis through the war on terror, and strip the federal courts of jurisdiction to hear almost all constitutional claims against what is taking place. This is the Guantanamoization of domestic political life, where views that the executive branch deems un-American make one a domestic terrorist who can be jailed or assassinated. After decades of unending war on the world, American imperialism, through the person of a flabby 80-year-old Hitler lover con man, has declared war on the American people. This initiative, directed by the insurrectionists from the scene of the crime they committed on January 6th, has not only instilled fear in the population, and this is important, it's also engendered a very profound level of hostility against the government. But this opposition, which is in many ways redolent of the opposition that was engendered by the British occupation of Boston, will not organically lead to social revolution. The sharpness of the crisis presents the party with immense political obligations. The administration is setting up a social clash of immense historic proportions, which is already unfolding, and the party and the working class have to be politically prepared for this. This report is going to try to detail some of the main elements, at least in a summary way, of the Trump administration's political strategy over these last 18 months, beginning with the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. In March 2025, Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. That statute was passed by the Federalists as part of the reactionary Alien and Sedition Acts of the same year. Under the act, the government may deport citizens of countries with which the United States is at war without any due process whatsoever, provided there is an invasion of the country underway. It was first invoked at the time of its passage in the panic of the Adams administration's undeclared war with France, and was aimed at the French and Irish émigrés who largely filled the ranks of the Jeffersonian opposition and whose crime was their sympathy for the French Revolution. When the same statute was invoked during the Second World War, it supplied the pseudo-legal authority for the internment of 120,000 people of Japanese descent. Invoking the act here meant claiming that a Venezuelan street gang has engaged in an quote-unquote invasion of the United States, integrating itself into workplaces, schools, apartment complexes in Aurora, Colorado. In sum, this amounts to a legal declaration that the government is in a state of war with the population. And that immigration, that is the massive influx of people, which has been a constant process and an element of the democratic nature of American society, popular culture and society, constitutes an invasion and justifies the suspension of constitutional rights for those who are here on U.S. soil and who unquestionably are protected by the Constitution. In many cases, individuals subject to the Alien Enemies Act were deported to the Secot torture chamber without hearings, judicial oversight, simply, for instance, for having tattoos and being Venezuelan. And the administration consistently violated court orders requiring compliance with the law, as in the case of the Maryland worker Kilmar Abrego Garcia. At roughly the same time Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act, the administration launched its crackdown on speech. In January, the administration issued 2 executive orders directing the government to strip visas and permanent residency of non-citizens who engaged in what it called anti-American activity or support for terrorism, as well as anti-Semitic activity, language that was so broad that it reached essentially any criticism of American foreign policy, and applied, at least in its initial iteration, above all, to those who were protesting the genocide in Gaza. The government set up a secret Tiger team to spy on and monitor the speech of student protesters. And then in March, the government went hunting. Federal agents moved onto campuses where the protests had been the largest and seized students, claiming their presence threatens foreign policy. And later in 2025, it detained a longtime DACA resident and continues to detain him by invoking for the first time a separate statutory provision from the bipartisan Real ID Act of 2006, barring non-citizens from, quote unquote, espousing support for terrorism based solely on social media posts. These are the methods of the Palmer raids of 1919 and 20, with the exception that the government has far more chilling tools at its disposal than J. Edgar Hoover and his cronies did during the Wilson administration. And now, as then, this censorship is aimed not only against non-citizens, but against all American citizens as well, because the First Amendment protects their right to listen to the views and the anti-genocide views espoused by their coworkers and classmates who were grabbed and thrown in the back of vans and sent to the internment camps in Texas and Georgia and Louisiana last year. And as a result of this campaign, individual targets like Rumeysa Ozturk and Mamadou Tall left the United States. Federal courts of appeals have recently ruled against Mahmoud Khalil and Mohsen Madawi, finding that a 1996 law that was also passed with bipartisan support, overwhelming bipartisan support, signed into law by the Clinton administration, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, stripped federal courts of jurisdiction to hear the First Amendment claims that Khalil and Madawi brought. Keep in mind, the First Amendment is not a dial. It is an on-off switch. Either speech is free or it is censored, and speakers and listeners intimidated through state-sanctioned chilling. However, it also has to be added here that the policy, if its goal was to suppress social discontent, has failed in the long run. On the contrary, it is engendering only further opposition to the anti-democratic character of the administration. The Trump administration has also invoked the Alien Registration Act, requiring every non-citizen in the United States aged 14 or older to register with the government and be fingerprinted, and to disclose membership in any left-wing political organizations, report any change of address. During the Second World War, 5 million people were registered under the authority of the ARA, each issued a numbered card to be carried at all times. The act was part of the Smith Act, which, as we know, was passed by a Democratic Congress, signed into law by Franklin Roosevelt, and it also made it a federal crime to advocate or belong to any organization that advocated revolution. This was the first peacetime federal sedition law since 1798, and it was used for the first time against the Socialist Workers' Party. And in this single statute, Congress fused the attack on free speech with a national registry that made every non-citizen locatable and identifiable. This registry was also the operational foundation for Japanese internment. And beginning in April 2025, the Trump administration invoked its provisions, which had been dormant since the Second World War, with a couple minor exceptions, making failure to register or failure to carry proof of registration a federal crime punishable by imprisonment. The administration has also undertaken a historically unprecedented expansion of immigrant detention. When Trump returned to office in January 2025, ICE held roughly 39,000 people in custody on any given day. Now that number has almost doubled, and Congress has appropriated tens of billions of dollars more in the last year for expanding the bed capacity to 140,000. By February 2026, ICE was holding people across 456 separate facilities, many of which are the details of which are not publicly disclosed. The expansion is not only numeric, it also involves a qualitative transformation of the conditions in the facilities themselves, where in certain important trial balloon examples are trending toward a level of depravity that rises to the level of state murder. For instance, the Everglades detention facility in Florida, known as Alligator Alcatraz, was opened last July and held roughly 3,000 people. Amnesty International conducted a research mission there in the fall of 2025, documenting conditions that it concluded amounted to torture, toilets overflowing with sewage in the areas where people slept, cameras positioned directly above toilets, lights left on 24 hours a day, chronic denial of medical care, extreme heat with no adequate protection from insects with disease spreading throughout the facility. That camp was closed for the time being earlier this summer, following a massive public outcry, but the administration continues to have plans to operate many such facilities. Another facility, Camp East Montana, located outside of El Paso, Texas, built on the site of Fort Bliss, which was a Japanese internment center during the Second World War, also opened last summer in August. It had a capacity of 5,000 people, making it the largest single facility in the country. A joint investigation by Human Rights Watch and the ACLU, which interviewed more than 80 people who had been detained there, documented guards beating detainees in retaliation for hunger strikes, requests for medical care being denied systematically, the imposition of collective punishment on entire cells, holding people for months and including for many weeks in solitary confinement in a facility contracted for stays of no more than 1 or 2 weeks maximum. And throughout the whole detention system, 2025 was by far the deadliest year on record, with more deaths than the preceding 4 years combined. The 2 family detention centers in Texas that they've only really reopened one of them, the Dilley facility. There's another one called the Carnes facility, which is just down the road. Both of these facilities were built and staffed under the Obama-Biden administration in 2014 in a deliberate policy expanding family detention meant by the Obama administration to deter mass migration from Central America. Fort Bliss and other military installations were used to detain children under Obama, that in 2014 as well, and again under Trump's first term. Biden discussed restarting family detention as recently as 2023 before Trump revived it in 2025. The camps of the current period are an expansion of an apparatus that both parties funded, cited, and staffed for 3 decades and counting. What is new and what marks a break not only in degree, but in the character of the thing itself, is the scale of the current build-out and the documented record of torture and death that has followed directly from it. Also across 2025 and 2026, the administration deployed troops into American cities. It federalized California's National Guard, put Marines into Los Angeles, deployed soldiers to Chicago, Portland, Memphis, New Orleans, and in January 2026, under an operation that the government called Metro Surge, some 3,000 agents descended on Minneapolis. In the course of this operation and the protests that followed, agents opened fire on civilian protesters, killing 2 U.S. citizens, Renee Good and Alex Preddy. Can only be characterized as extrajudicial, point-blank state assassinations. The administration's response to this provocation that it created was to defend the killers and to turn the label of domestic terrorism against the victims themselves. And subsequently, as a comrade mentioned earlier today, the DOJ has charged 15 anti-ICE protesters in Minneapolis and is attempting to prosecute them as part of an Antifa conspiracy. These deployments, as Comrade Marty mentioned earlier, are unquestionably bound up with the upcoming midterm elections and Trump's plan to steal the election in 2028. Even Governor Pritzker of Illinois has charged directly that troops are being deployed to ensure that the Republican Party keeps control of Congress. Figures around the president have mused aloud about stationing immigration agents at polling places. The president himself has said he wished that he had deployed the Guard earlier. The administration is also engaged in a systematic operation to eviscerate due process for those trapped in the deportation and detention machine, with implications that go far beyond non-citizens. By executive fiat and memorandum, the government has reinterpreted immigration law to treat anybody who has entered the country without inspection, anybody who's crossed the border including people who have lived in the country for decades, married US citizens, raised American citizen children, to reclassify them as applicants for admission, a legal term of art, which puts them in a category of people who can be detained for the entire length of their removal proceedings without ever having the right to appear before an immigration judge on a bond hearing to determine whether they can be released from detention when their case is proceeding. The constitutional importance of that is immense because the federal government cannot detain anybody, cannot take away anybody's liberty without having a reason. But the interpretation of the Trump administration, though it's currently being litigated through the courts, has resulted in tens of thousands of people with substantial connections to the country being held more or less on an indefinite basis without the ability to appear before a judge for a bond hearing. The mass deportation process, and that law specifically that stripped individuals of the right to bond hearings if they're quote unquote applicants for admission, is also the product of laws passed by both parties. And this is a process that is so stacked against the detained person or the non-citizen that the word process really doesn't apply. There is no right to counsel. There is no Eighth Amendment protection from essentially being subject to cruel and unusual punishment in detention. Unlike a criminal defendant, you don't have a Sixth Amendment right to a lawyer. You have a lesser right that is protected through the Fifth Amendment due process clause. You can be subject to deportation if you've been here for less than 2 years without any hearing at all. And individuals are increasingly being deported to third countries, not their own countries, in many cases, countries in Africa where they're sent right to a prison camp. People like Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was essentially disappeared under the Alien Enemies Act and sent to the torture chamber at Secot, is one example. And the immigration courts, to the extent that they can be called that, and they're part of the executive branch inside the Department of Justice, where you can be fired by the president or the attorney general for disloyalty. Trump has purged the immigration judges and the appellate board of immigration appeals of any judge who doesn't essentially deny all asylum claims and other claims for relief from removal. Again, this is not just an attack on the individuals who are subject to these processes and their relatives. The Constitution does not confine its protections to citizens. The word that the framers chose was the people, and you can't deprive persons of liberty without due process. So the effort by the administration to eliminate due process rights for those who have been in this country for decades and have essentially equal protection of the Constitution than any American citizen is chilling and has to be understood. While enforcing these measures, the administration has also crossed into systematic, open non-compliance with federal court orders, deeming their policies unconstitutional. The principle of separation of powers has existed as a bedrock of the American bourgeois democratic order since shortly after the Constitution was ratified. The courts subject the actions of the executive branch and Congress to constitutional analysis to determine whether their actions are legal or not. Be as it may, the fact that these are unelected judges, they do play a constitutional role. But when a federal judge ordered planes carrying men removed under the Alien Enemies Act and made them turn back mid-flight, the administration told them to keep going anyway, to land in a foreign destination, and later said it was simply an error that they could not correct. In Minnesota, one federal judge found that 96 separate court orders had been violated in Minnesota in the month of January 2026 alone. Judges reviewing these patterns have in some cases stated that there is no more presumption of regularity. That is the presumption that the government doesn't lie. And that in a matter of months, it has, according to these judges, forfeited trust earned over many generations. There was one Reagan-appointed judge in a federal court of appeals who said that if the executive branch can deport people without due process and in disregard of court orders, quote, "what assurance will there be tomorrow that it will not deport American citizens as well?" end quote. And that is, of course, something that Trump has also mused about on social media. The administration has launched a violent campaign against the district judges. Deputy Attorney General Todd, well, now he'll become the Attorney General, Todd Blanche, acting Attorney General now, told the Federalist Society in November 2025 that the Department of Justice is effectively at war, that was his term, with federal district courts, accusing judges who ruled against the administration of being rogue activists, abusing their office. Stephen Miller has referred to any judge who rules against the administration as part of a quote-unquote judicial insurrection. Trump himself has called judges monsters, lunatics, communist, radical left judges. The U.S. Marshal Service, which protects the roughly 2,600 active federal judges, has noted that there were 564 credible threats against judges in 2025, and that number was already likely to be surpassed in 2026. It prompted Chief Justice John Roberts of the Supreme Court, who only rarely comments on current controversies, to twice warn publicly that personal attacks on judges are dangerous, even while ruling in favor of the president responsible for this and denying that those threats are the responsibility of any particular person or party. Getting toward the end here, just last week, there's another very important recent development. The administration invoked, for the first time in its history, a secret immigration court called the Alien Terrorist Removal Court. This was created by the bipartisan Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, signed into law by Clinton. The law created a special tribunal, the ATRC, which is unlike anything in American history. It gives the attorney, at least on American soil, it gives the attorney general the power to detain and deport any non-citizen on the strength of secret evidence. The government, through this ATRC process, puts a classified case before the judge in secret. The target and their lawyer are not allowed to confront the confidential witnesses. They have no right to hear the classified arguments. They cannot apply for asylum or any other form of relief from deportation. And there's not even a right to challenge. The statute expressly prohibits them from challenging the constitutionality of how the evidence against them was even acquired, which means that if somebody had been tortured and pointed the finger at someone who's lived in this country for decades and decades, they can be detained by the federal government and whisked out of this country without ever getting to know what the evidence was, without getting to challenge the way the evidence was gathered, without getting to hear the government's arguments against them. And that is simply something which is completely outside. I mean, the Walter Raleigh had greater protections when he was tried in the Tower of London. But this is a significant moment because, again, this law has been in effect since 1996. No president has used it because the constitutional implications are so sweeping. This is a process which unquestionably violates the due process rights of people on U.S. soil who have constitutional protections. This is the machinery of Guantanamo Bay and military commissions on U.S. soil under conditions of no viable emergency. This is not Abraham Lincoln suspending habeas corpus to put down the slaveholders' rebellion. And again, that a bipartisan Congress built this machinery and left it in Trump's drawer confirms the role that has been played by both parties in paving the way for Trump's Operation Dictatorship today. The last single example I want to give is the most important, and that is the attack on birthright citizenship. On the first day of Trump's second term, he issued a declaration that children born on American soil to undocumented parents or to parents on temporary visas, that is, even people who are here lawfully, cannot be citizens. The principle of jus soli, the right of the soil, is the democratic principle of the New World, set against the old European rule of citizenship by blood, under which legal belonging descends by lineage, and a person is fixed at birth in the caste of his ancestors. The principle of citizenship by birthright was written into the Constitution after the Civil War to destroy forever the doctrine behind the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, which had held that slaves born in this country possess no rights to citizenship that the government was bound to respect. Trump made this specific issue the backbone of this legal and political strategy. He personally attended the Supreme Court oral arguments, the first time any president has done so in history. And as we've noted, the Supreme Court came one vote away from ruling that the president can overturn the cornerstone of the 14th Amendment, the product of the American Civil War, which incorporated in a way that in many ways the principles of the Declaration of Independence into the Constitution for the first time, simply by signing his pen to paper. The four justices, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas, held that the Constitution does not provide birthright citizenship to all non-citizens born on U.S. soil. Their rationale is fascistic. They argue that non-citizens lack complete and exclusive allegiance to the United States and its government, such that the child of a foreigner owes allegiance elsewhere and may be excluded from the country by his birth. This is a revival of the logic of Dred Scott itself, because it asserts that ancestry and not birth determine one's access to the rights of citizenship, and that a class of people may be born within the country and condemned by descent to permanent exclusion, more or less a hereditary caste of stateless persons living in the United States, passed from parent to child. That the Supreme Court came one vote away of abandoning one of the most central democratic achievements of the Civil War is a remarkable testament to the rot that pervades all of the institutions of American capitalism. Recall that one of the grievances listed against King George, enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, was that he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners. This obviously goes far beyond anything that they could have imagined. And in addition to the attack on birthright citizenship, the administration is moving to strip citizenship through the denaturalization process, and intimating that it's going to begin doing so based on the political views of the citizen. Justice Department memorandum from June 2025 made denaturalization a top enforcement priority, and now field offices have been given internal guidances to supply 1 to 200 cases for trial in the next year or so. I'm going to begin to conclude here. The historical context here has hopefully come out. Every legal instrument that's now being used to advance Trump's plot for dictatorship was designed, built, and defended over the last 30 years in particular by administrations of both parties, and the Democratic Party played an active role at each stage of this process. In 1994, it was Bill Clinton who launched Operation Gatekeeper, which militarized the borders in Texas and California, and adding agents, checkpoints, walls, detention beds, deliberately funneling immigrants not through the urban centers where they could do it safely, but through the deserts where thousands of them have died in the intervening years. 1996, 2 years later, Democratic Congress and Clinton administration signed the laws that we referenced earlier, which essentially remade American immigration system into an engine of mass repression, undoing the 1960s era's Hart-Celler laws, which had, at least for a brief span of time, somewhat liberalized the American immigration system compared with an earlier period of exclusion and racial quotas. It made mandatory detention for broad classes of immigrants. It invented removal without hearings. It gutted judicial review. And after September 11th, the bipartisan Congress used the so-called war on terror as a basis for massive expansion of speech-related and similar surveillance-related programs of state repression. Obama administration deported more people than any administration before it, created family detention, and after Trump's January 6th plot came inches short of success, the Biden administration spent the next 4 years systematically dismantling the right to asylum, normalizing the fascistic language that the Trump administration had used against immigrants, deployed CBP agents to whip Haitians crossing the Rio Grande. It kept Trump-era expulsions, Title 42 expulsions from the pandemic in force for more than 2 years, even as long after it got rid of all of the actual protections to stop the spread of the disease. In July 2024, the Biden administration shut the border to all asylum seekers, suspending the right whenever crossings passed a certain threshold. Tent cities where disease, children lived in disease and mud and squalor all along the border in Mexico, expanded expedited removal, continued to build the border wall it had promised to halt, carried out more removals in a single year than the Trump administration had done in years prior. And by the time Obama left office, the Democratic Party had essentially carried out much of Trump's anti-immigrant policies. 2024, Kamala Harris ran a right-wing campaign on immigration, stressing her support for border security, saying she would be tough, smart solutions to secure the border. She was promoted by the DSA, figures like Ocasio-Cortez, and the nationalist Bernie Sanders, who has since praised Trump's border policies, saying he prefers them to Biden's, who infamously denounced immigration for undermining American wages, dismissing open borders as a Koch brothers proposal that will make everybody in America poorer. And during the massive protests that developed in the aftermath of the state murder on Renee Good and Alex Preddy, the Democrats and the union apparatus worked systematically to prevent the movement from developing toward a general strike, and in so doing, gave active political support and to the Trump administration. So to conclude, to summarize, the Trump administration is using immigration as the basis of its strategy to establish a dictatorship. It's using tools given to it by Democrats. While non-citizens may be the immediate targets, each element of the Trump administration's political initiative is directed at the population as a whole, and specifically against left-wing political views and socialism, about which Trump rants with increasing regularity and hysteria. These policies have engendered deep social opposition, but it is also the issue upon which Trump is attempting to build a mass base for his reactionary program, taking advantage of the confusion caused by decades of national chauvinism promoted by both parties and the trade union apparatus. Marx, in an 1870 letter to Siegfried Meyer and August Voigt, discussed the antagonism fostered by the British ruling class between English and Irish workers. He wrote, "This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organization. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this." End quote. For the American ruling class, the attack on immigrants has always been, it really is the case, has always been a keystone mechanism for the suppression of communism, socialism, and revolution. It's been a constant from the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798 and the deportation of French immigrant supporters of the revolution in France. The first speech-related immigration restrictions were imposed after the assassination of President McKinley by a self-described anarchist. The Palmer raids, the national origin quotas of the 1920s, the Smith Act, the Clinton and Bush era laws, and the crackdown on socialist and left-wing speech today. Perhaps no ruling class recognizes better than the American ruling class that the objective process of international migration and the integration of the working class across national barriers contains within it a revolutionary kernel, that the flow of people and the flow of left-wing ideas are inextricably linked, that nationalist reaction and the restrictionism are the antidotes, because experience has taught the ruling class that blocking the unity of the working class through the fostering of racial and national division is a necessary component of its strategy of self-preservation. But the decisive question now is the subjective factor. Whether Trump's strategy succeeds or not will depend on the intervention of the party. Trump is not a mastermind. He has a strategy. His advisors are well read on the strategy of the Nazis, but he's also an improviser who is searching with some difficulty to build a mass base. His strategy is the product not ultimately of strength, but of weakness in many regards, and it's reaching more and more feverish dimensions as workers come into conflict with the oligarchic character of his rule. This places the resolution's importance in full focus, and in particular, on the need to develop the opposition to Trump's strategy among the rank and file and the working class. It's necessary that we intervene forcefully to forge the unity of the working class across all national backgrounds, to mobilize the working class in defense of basic democratic rights, and to root the democratic struggle in the fight for the urgent economic needs of masses of working people of all backgrounds and the struggle for socialism. Our resolution calls for full rights for all workers, regardless of where they're from, to travel the world as they see fit. That is an absolute necessity in the integrated world of the 21st century. I think one comrade made a comment in the resolution with which I agree, that we are not only calling for the abolition of ICE and CBP and their replacement by some other agency within the executive branch. We're calling for the dismantling of the entire apparatus, the shutting down of the Department of Homeland Security as a whole. I'll conclude just by reading this paragraph. The demands will not be realized through the courts nor through the Democratic Party. They will be realized through the independent mass mobilization of the working class, the defense of immigrant workers by their coworkers and neighbors, organized through rank and file committees in every workplace and neighborhood, and the mobilization of full industrial and social power of the working class against the police state buildup. The defense of immigrants is the defense of the working class as a whole, and a component of the fight for the unity of workers of the Americas in the world socialist revolution. We're not making an appeal that the ruling class change this or that policy or try to somehow slightly ameliorate conditions in the detention camps. This resolution recognizes that in the 21st century, the right of a worker to travel the world freely without fear of death or detention is a fundamental one. This is not an American phenomenon, as the response this week to the governments in Europe to the events in Morocco and Spain show. The defense of immigrants must serve as the spearhead of the defense of the democratic rights of the entire working class in the global counteroffensive against social counter-revolution. And no genuine defense of immigrants is possible without opposition to imperialist war and the reactionary nationalist climate that war inevitably fosters. The defense of immigrants is not merely one important democratic question among many. It is a strategic one for the revolutionary movement, a necessary prerequisite for reviving socialist internationalism within the working class and for forging the political unity of the 21st century working class internationally. Thank you.